So cities are exciting, and yet cities are also challenging. In some ways, all cities share some common dynamics. Cities are complex. Cities are full of life. They're constantly changing, which makes them challenging. They're strategic in God's kingdom. And every city you go to, God's already at work in that city. So God works in cities. It's not a coincidence that the Holy Spirit came to a city during a festival. So the Holy Spirit comes at Pentecost to Jerusalem, and the gospel is spread to the known world in the next 20 years very naturally because people come to cities, and whatever happens in cities gets exported through the engine of the city. So God's using the natural dynamics of the city to spread the gospel very quickly at a time where there was no internet, no technology, no super fast trains going from Boston to New York in 20 minutes. Just people walking around, and yet the gospel spreads because of the dynamics of cities. So cities have this life and this dynamism, and yet every city is also different. My guess is, I don't know much about Chinese cities, but my guess is Beijing is very different than Nanjing, and is very different than some of the cities that you're from. I know that Pretoria is very different than Boston. Beijing, population 21, 22 million. Boston, 640,000. If you start to expand your boundary of Boston and include everyone that could possibly commute to Boston, you end up at about 7 or 8 million. Still much, much smaller. But there's things that make Boston unique as a city. So Stephen said knowledge is a word to describe Boston. You could also say busy. We're one of the busiest cities in the world in terms of just the pace of life. Intellectual would be a good word. Snowy. So at my back porch this winter, 7 feet of snow across the whole back porch. We had the snowiest winter on record, the second coldest winter. The snow did not go away. A snowy city. We're also a post-Christian city. And we're leading America in sort of, us along with a few other cities on the West Coast, in terms of being a post-Christian city where people, when you bring the gospel, they say we've been there and done that. And that's really changing our dynamics pretty dramatically. One of the things I love about Boston, and what I think is a key thing about Boston, is it's a small city. And so it's a doable city. You can get your hand around Boston. You can know the key leaders. We're about the same size as one of the boroughs of New York City, the whole city. And so you can get to know the city, and that creates a lot of great dynamics for ministry because you can see what's happening. So I love Boston. I came to Boston in 1981. I graduated from Princeton University. I'm a civil engineer by training, and I got a job here. So I didn't really choose to come. As a matter of fact, it was the only job I got out of college. But in a couple years before that, in 1979, I attended a conference, kind of like this conference, but a little bigger, called Urbana in Chicago, Urbana, Illinois. And one of the pastors there said, some of you are going to be called to the city. This is Dr. Michael Haynes, who was actually the pastor at 12th Baptist Church in Boston. He was Martin Luther King's pastor. And he said, some of you are going to be called to the city. And here this suburban white kid from Princeton feels the call of God, this arrow go into my heart. I had no idea what that meant. I didn't like cities. I went to Princeton instead of MIT because it was in a bucolic, rural setting. I didn't want to be in a city. And here's God saying, I want you to go to the city. So I graduated from college, got a job, and I moved to Boston and started exploring the city. I volunteered at a place I looked in the yellow pages trying to find something urban I could do. Found a place called Christians for Urban Justice. That sounded promising. Started meeting people. We ended up moving. We had some friends that had a similar calling. We ended up moving to a neighborhood in Boston in 1986 where they were giving away land. This doesn't happen in Boston anymore, by the way, if you're looking to do this. It doesn't work like this anymore. But they were saying, if you will live here, we'll give you the land, if you'll build a house. So we built a house with our friends in 1986, and we brought actually 4 couples and 2 singles intentionally moved into this inner city neighborhood together. And I raised my family there. We've been there ever since. So learning to connect to the city, learning to create community in a city, and learning to move from being afraid of cities to falling in love with the city that God has called me to. And that's been I couldn't imagine living anywhere else. And so during this time, I discovered the Emmanuel Gospel Center. I was asked to be on the board. They were looking for business people to be on the board, and I had an engineering degree, and they didn't know what else to do with me. So they invited me to be on the board in 1986, and I served them some, and then they sort of slowly started drawing me in. I joined the staff in 1981, and I've been stuck there ever since, but serving the city in a good way. So I want to tell you a little bit about the Gospel Center. We started with our roots in modern technology. So this is a picture of our modern technology. This is in 1920. This was state-of-the-art techno gospel preaching. So this is a truck with a church building built on it. The steeple is a radio tower, so they could broadcast what they were preaching. This really was high tech. They had sound system. It was called the Little Church on Wheels, and they would drive this thing up to a park, and they would preach out of this, standing on the back of this truck. They would get 2,000 people gathered around. They saw many, many people come to the Lord during the 1920s and early 30s. This is Mr. and Mrs. Morgan. In 1938, they decided that they wanted to be a year-round ministry. So remember snow, 7 feet of snow? You can't do this all year round. You can only do this in the summertime. And so they incorporated the ministry in a building and came inside, and we founded the Emmanuel Gospel Center, which existed from 1938 until the 60s as an outreach to the south end of Boston. The south end is a small neighborhood just south of downtown, but now on the north side of Boston, as Boston's expanded dramatically to the south with the neighborhoods. And we had ministries that would preach to children and to elderly people and work with kids in the neighborhood. In the 1960s, though, we started to discover the immigrant church. Boston was changing. Cities are changing. And as we discovered the immigrant church, we realized that we would be much more effective not helping people one at a time and doing our own ministry, but let's get behind these Latino pastors that are moving into, let's get behind these African American and Asian and Haitian pastors as they're moving into the city and support their work. They'll be much more effective in reaching what Boston is becoming than we will be from our location. And so in the 1960s, we started changing from being a direct service ministry into being a supporting the church ministry, serving the local church, serving local pastors, and helping them be more effective. So if you want to learn more about EGC, I don't want to take a lot of time to talk about that, but we have a website, obviously. Very simple, egc.org. It's all there, the history, all the ministries that we do now, but it's all in service of the church. And since the 1960s, we have learned a lot about how to do ministry in the city effectively. It's the staff of the center sort of reflects the character of Boston. People like me that come to Boston like thinking about ministry. I'm an engineer, I'm not a minister, so I bring a different perspective to ministry than a lot of ministers do. And so we've always attracted folks that think about ministry. We started learning from people at MIT about systems thinking, read Forrester's Urban Dynamics, started understanding what does it take to really be effective in an urban setting. And we've developed this style of ministry that we call living system ministry, okay? And I want to tell you about living system ministry by telling you about the cat and the toaster, okay? And I have a volunteer, Alan Platt has been volunteered for this purpose. Thank you, Alan. So Alan, how are you?
I'm good.
Why don't you stand on this side, okay? So you have a toaster, okay? And your toaster is broken. It doesn't make toast anymore, okay? So what are you going to do about it? I have some tools here. Here, take a hammer and fix that toaster. Would that probably wouldn't work, would it?
It's not going to work.
It's not going to work. All right, maybe if you had a screwdriver, I'll take the hammer back so it's not, I don't want you to be unsafe, yeah. So I really don't want you to, but talk about what you might do to fix the toaster.
Here's the engineer asking the part. I don't know where
So you might start.
I might screw
yeah, there you
loose
go.
here
Yeah.
and
You take it apart, right?
Right.
You might figure out that the filament's broken. You could decide you could order a new filament on the internet, go to Amazon, and it'll deliver for free if you have Amazon Prime. And 2 weeks later it comes, you put it in. You probably want to clean everything while it's taken apart, because if that's the real trick, you just clean everything. You put it back together, and then the toaster probably will work, and you can have toast. And honestly, it's a toaster. If the toaster's broken, throw it away. Buy a new toaster. It's probably a lot easier just to do that in the first place, right?
I do that.
Brilliant. Okay, so don't go away. Stay there. Here. Now let's pretend that's a cat. That's a stuffed cat, okay? Now, your cat is sick. Would you use the hammer on the cat?
Oh, no.
No? Well, how about the pliers? Probably not. The screwdriver? I had that screwdriver back. I'm dangerous with the cat. How is the cat different than the toaster? Yeah, so they're saying it. How's the cat different than the toaster?
Well, that's a technical.
Yes.
This is an emotion.
That works. That works. The cat's alive. What would happen if you took the screwdriver to the cat?
No.
Well, the cat would probably defend itself, first of all, right? It would probably scratch you, right? And it would not let you do that. But if you were successful in taking the cat apart, you're probably not going to be able to put it back together.
Can't clean the cat.
You can't clean the cat and put it back. You can't go away. And you don't want to just throw the cat away and get a new cat because you love the cat, right?
No, because I lose my wife.
That's right. That's exactly right. Thank you. Thank you. You can sit down. Let's give him a round of applause. So the point of this, can you guess the point of this? Your church, your family, your neighborhood, the things you're called to in ministry, are they toasters or are they cats? They're cats. Okay, if you don't remember anything else from today, except for everything Stephen said, remember that. Remember that God's called us to work in living systems. These systems will defend themselves. These systems are going to be changing. We got to learn to love them. They don't just come apart and be put back together. We have to use the right tools for the right job. So I actually have 3 lessons about working in living systems that we've learned over the years that I'm going to share with you very briefly. The first is we're always learning. So we talked about urban dynamics. Every city's different. You got to get to know your city. You got to learn actually to love your city. You don't have any business working in a city, working with people, unless you really learn to love them. And the way you learn to love it is by getting to know it, right? That works with people. It works in ministry. So learn to love your city. Get out there, figure out what's going on, ask questions. Our experience is that cities are constantly changing. We never really know what's going on until you start asking. Every city I go to, I ask questions about the church in the city. And the church leaders think they know a lot, but unless they've done research recently, they really don't know everything that's going on in their city. Going to a pastor in a church in London. Are there any, we've seen Indian people around here. Are there any Indian churches? No, we don't have any of those. And then going out in 5 minutes finding like 4 small Indian storefront churches because they didn't really know where to look. Okay, so go out and understand your city, research it, get to know it, fall in love with it. Okay, and keep re-falling in love with it. We say at EGC there's no experts in urban ministry because we always need to be in the posture of learning. Learning is a constant attitude of ministry, okay? So an example of the need to learn is what we call Boston's quiet revival. So this is a graph that shows the red line is the number of churches in the city, and the gray thing behind it is the population of the city. So I've been working in Boston since 1991. We have staff that have been there since the 60s. In the 1990s, after we've been doing the supporting ministry for 20 years, somebody asked us, how come the church in Boston is dying? So this was the prevalent view of the church in the city. In fact, we were halfway up that red line at that time. The number of churches was growing dramatically, and along with the growth of the church was the growth in the health of the church, growth in ministry of the church. It wasn't just churches splitting, it was real health, it was real growth, and people didn't see it because it wasn't happening in ways that people were used to thinking about the church. It wasn't happening in the white church. It wasn't happening in the church with the steeple. Honestly, it wasn't always happening in churches by people trained by Gordon Conwell. God was importing vitality into the city. People were meeting in the afternoons. People were having church in languages other than English, and it was revitalized. God's been revitalizing the church in Boston, and we wouldn't have known about that if we hadn't made this graph. I went out there and taken the data. We actually counted churches on a number of points along this graph, started to see the trends, and now we are keeping up with that data constantly. It's completely changed how we approach ministry because we see the vitality of the church and we understand what God's doing. But if we weren't in learning mode, we would have been just along with everyone else, I can't tell you how many church planners come into Boston, even now, and say, essentially, we're the first ones here with the gospel. One church planner said, Boston is a city practically devoid of gospel witness. This is like 2 years ago they said this. How long have you been here, Steve? 15 years. So I would be kind of offended by that if I were you. But that's the national narrative. They see us as a post-Christian city. They don't see how God's at work. But that takes work to discover how God's at work in your city. So I encourage you, I challenge you, I implore you to learn about your city and fall in love with your city and keep learning about your city, keep re-falling in love with your city. So the first point is learn to love your city, okay? No, yes, well, the first point is be always learning. So the learning is the key part there. The second point from Living System Ministry is connect with the system or the systems of your city. Again, I said before that God is already at work in your city, and your job is not to come in with some grand plan that you learned in seminary or that you learned in business school or whatever, but your job is to understand and connect with what God's already doing. And God's already working amidst the systems of the city, and things like the school system and the people systems, the social systems of the city. Now there might need to be some modifications to connect those well with the gospel, but the raw material is already there. You want to understand and start connecting with the systems of the city. We teach people to ask systems questions. The systems question is not, we tend to come in and say, what can I do to reach Boston for Christ? Or I go to church in a neighborhood of Boston called Jamaica Plain. What would it take for my church to reach Jamaica Plain for Christ? That's a me question. A systems question is, what would it take for Jamaica Plain to be reached for Christ? See the difference? It's not how I will do it. It's not how I would do the job. It's how would the job get done? Now, that seems like a little parlor trick. I'm just asking the question differently. But actually, if you ask the question differently, you'll get different answers. Okay, so it's not, you realize if you want to reach Boston, you want to reach Jamaica Plain for Christ, you're going to have to work together. You're going to have to connect with the systems of the city. You're going to have to connect with what God's already doing in the city. Does that make sense? So just turning it around, connecting with the systems of the city is really important. An example of this is we're working a lot in church school partnerships in Boston. So connecting with the school system. And we found that our best approach to the school system is not coming in with a plan, here's how we're going to rescue the schools, but going to a principal after we've talked to the powers that be in the central office to get their permission to do this, and say, how can we serve you? So we're not coming with a plan, we're coming as the church as servants of the city, okay? And we're connecting with the systems that are already there. And the principal, there's one school, the Trotter School in Boston, the principal said, clean our building. And so the church cleaned the building. The building hadn't been cleaned in years. They bleached everything. They scraped off all the gum from under all the desks. They planted outside. They made that building beautiful. The Trotter School in the past 5 years has gone from one of the worst schools in Boston to one of the best. There's been a whole bunch of people working on that. But one of the things they attribute to the change in the church, in the school, is the kids are healthier. There's not as much asthma. And so the healthy school building has led to better academic outcomes for the students, and that's because of the church and this church partnership, which then grew from there. And the church coming, willing to serve, as Steve talked about, changed the relationship. And now there's strong relationships between the schools that the school system is asking, we want a church partner for every school in the city. And the Gospel Center is working on our behind-the-scenes role of saying, let's do that. Let's get the churches to do that. So we're trying to, Ruth Wong, whose dad's here somewhere in the room, is our leader in that. So we have good leadership in this area, okay? So connect with the system of your city. Keep learning, connect with the system, and the final thing is equip yourself with the right tools. You don't want to use a hammer for everything, okay? Even if you own a hammer. There are times when hammers are useful to drive in nails, but don't use a hammer to try to fix your cat or even fix your toaster. And so there's a lot of wisdom to be had. I'm holding a hammer now. A lot of wisdom to be had in terms of selecting the right tools. Okay, using the wrong tools can do damage to the systems. And it can do damage to the cause of the gospel in your city. It can do damage to the work that other people are doing sometimes. So by tools here, I'm talking about methods, programs, your approach to ministry. Just because you learn a program or because it works at somebody else's church doesn't mean that it'll work in your church or in your city, okay? Programs need to be usually tailored to their setting. There's a lot of books about this. Toxic charity, When Helping Hurts, document this phenomenon of counterproductivity. People trying to do good end up doing bad, doing a lot more harm in the city than people that are trying to do bad do often. And so the two lessons about that are, one is be careful of your tools, give them real thought, make sure they fit, make sure you're using cat tools on cats and toaster tools on toasters and do things that really fit. Customize them for your setting. And then look for the unintended consequences that might be happening. These unintended consequences are always lurking, things you don't expect. And if you pay attention to them, you can quickly repent and adjust. So a big byword for urban ministry is adjust. Okay, you're going to always be adjusting. Whatever you're going to do is probably not going to work the first time. You're going to have to keep learning, connecting, adjusting. And one good way to adjust is by paying attention to the unintended consequences. Brief example of that, we worked with a church about 10 years ago that had a great evangelism program. They learned this evangelism program. They took it to their neighborhood. They started seeing people come to Christ. A couple years later, the church was realizing that all these people who were coming to Christ were leaving the church. And so this evangelism program that was leading people to Christ was effectively de-evangelizing the neighborhood because people were coming to church and were having a bad experience and weren't staying. And so now the neighborhood's seated with all these people that don't want to come to church anymore because I've been there, I've tried that. So their evangelism program became counterproductive to evangelism. Thank God they noticed this. They made some adjustments to the program, and more importantly, they made some adjustments to the church to start receiving people better. And now the church has thrived. It's one of the thriving churches on the west side of Boston. But they saw the counterproductive dynamics that were happening and were able to make some changes as a result. So the tools are important. They matter and need to be customized, okay? Living system ministry, that we try to boil down. There's a lot to this, but I boil it down into 3 words, okay? Learn, connect, equip, okay? And there's a cycle. You never stop doing these things. So learning about the city, about your context, connecting, getting to know the people involved, developing relationships, and then equipping, doing the things that you're called to do as you continue to learn, as you continue to develop relationships, okay? So learn, connect, equip is a summary, very briefly, of living system ministry, all right? Again, there's more resources about it on our website, more things about the cat and the toaster. There's a book called The Cat and the Toaster. If you really want to learn more, it's about that thick, much thicker than Stephen's book, which is about that thick, which is a better book. But anyway, so I encourage you all, in conclusion, to follow your calling. Come to the city. Some of you, like Alan, are going to be called to plant churches. Some of you are going to be called to pastor and to teach, like Stephen Om. Some of you may be called, like me, to be in a supporting role, to help people plant churches and do the things that they're doing. Whatever you're called to, I encourage you to follow your call with passion. But remember, God is already at work in the living systems to which He's called you. He's already at work in your city. Get to know your city, fall in love with your city, find God where He's working, and play your part. Thank you.